For your project proposals, you need to make a mock-up of the graphical user interface you plan to use for your application. It just takes a few minutes to create a mock-up. By mock-up, I mean that it does not actually need to connect to a script. However, it can show which types of parameters you plan to use and what default values they will have. This video demonstrates how easy it is to create a mockup like the one shown here by using the Script Tool wizard. Before you start creating your mockup, make a table of the parameters you plan to use. Try to decide on the data type each one should be. You can always come back and change this when you learn more about the available data types. For each one, decide if it should be required or optional, and if it should be input that the user provides or output that the script creates. Also, determine a default value for each parameter. Last, after watching this video, you'll have some ideas about how to use filters to specify a set of choices for the user. Multi-value to determine whether the user must select exactly one of the choices or should they be allowed to designate multiple items. And finally, you'll see if you want to use the obtain from property to automatically populate one parameter based on another. Here we have a table that describes 10 parameters. Next, we'll create a script tool with these parameters. Like any good cooking show, we have one made already that we can look at quickly before we start to create it. So all of these buttons that you see on here are live. Wherever you see those down arrows, you can pull down and see a menu that's called a combo box. I'm checking and unchecking, and that's a calendar, and this is a slide bar. So that's our goal, to make something that looks just like that. The script tool has to live inside of a toolbox, so we first create a toolbox, and then we create a script tool inside of there. The label is the thing that you see at the top of the window when it pops up, so it's worth making a label that makes sense. I like to make the name the same as the label when possible, and the name doesn't allow you to have spaces in it, so I've put dashes in there. The information that you type in the description will be displayed in the help box on the right when the tool launches. And for this, we're just making a mock-up, so don't worry about selecting store relative path. Don't worry about selecting a script file. This is not going to do anything. Alright, so now we go and start making our parameters as we've listed them in our table. The column on the left is the label that will appear near the box or slider or other kind of widget, and the data type on the right, it determines what kind of a box you get, whether you get a slider or something with a folder in it. Alright, so now we've moved on to setting the data type to feature class, and we want this to be a required input. Well, that's the default. And we want to also set a default value for this so that when it pops up, it's not an empty box. We're going to assume that the Scratch directory is a good place, and it has a file named farmland.shp. So that's our default value. And now we're moving on to the next parameter. We're setting that display text, which will appear to prompt the user to tell them what to do. So you want to make that as useful as possible in explaining what it is that you want the user to do. Now, for this one, we're going to specify a field data type. So that's going to be the field in a data set that the user selects, and they're going to specify the data field that has the land cover. By default, we're setting that to cover, and there's another feature that you can use for certain types that's called obtain from. So notice when we pulled down that obtain from menu, it had a choice, which was our first parameter, and that's because that's a parameter that we've already specified that has fields in it. Any parameter that you specify that has fields in it can be used as obtained from for a field data type. So now we're moving on to the minimum plot size input, and we want an aerial unit for this because we're talking about the farmland plots sizes, and that is we want it to be a required input. In other words, the user can't just leave that blank and run the tool. We're setting the default. We want to set the default to 1 acre. We specify that, and notice that it changes it to something that's allowed automatically for us. So we want to specify a buffer size, and that is going to be a linear unit since we need a linear data type for that. We want it to be a required input, and we're going to set a default value of 0.5 kilometers. Now I tried putting in km and it changed it to unknown. So if you don't get a word that's close enough to what it wants, it will just say unknown. In this case, I typed it all lowercase. It changed the K to uppercase. Now for our next parameter, we want to have the user be able to specify what fruit types are in the farmland and the orchards that we're looking at. So since this is just descriptive words, it's a string, just like Python string. So we're going to set the string type, and we want to give them four choices so they don't select something that our code doesn't work with. So we set a default of apples, and then we go over to our to the filter set, and when you have set it to string, you get the choice of a value list where you can specify as many choices as you want, and this will appear either as a set of checkboxes or a drop-down menu that the user can select from. So that value list is set, and we want the user may have more than one type of fruit in the orchards that they're analyzing, so we want them to be able to check to set that to check, say, apples and pears. That's why we set that to multi-value. Okay, we're moving on to the output directory, and it doesn't have the choice of directory, and we don't want workspace. What we really want is a folder. Workspace would allow people to select things like file geodatabases as well. We want it to be a required input, and we want to set the default value to C, GIS540, Scratch, Orchards. Notice how whenever you click on a new line in the top, it changes the values of the parameter properties in the bottom box. So it's a little confusing until you get used to that. I also wanted to point out that there is an environment property, and you can use that to set a default value for a property that you're setting up, but we're not going to use that this time. Next, we want the user to be able to specify whether or not the orchards that they've uploaded are organic, and so we're using a Boolean. That term should look familiar. It can only be true or false. And we want this to be optional, so we change that type in the parameter properties box down there from required to optional. Now look, the default values, we only had two choices, and we specified false. It could only be true or false. And you'll watch when this is created, it creates, the organic has a checkbox next to it. So that's a different kind of interface it's creating. Now, last pruning, we want this to be a date. So there's a date data type, and we select that. We want it to be optional, and we want to specify that the default be February 1st of 2017. Next, we create we're on number 9, the quarter. So this is meant to be quarter of the year, so whether it's the first, second, third, or fourth. So since we want to specify 1, 2, 3, or 4, we're going to select something called a long. A long is very much like an integer, but that's what it's called in ArcGIS script data types. So we specify a long, and now we're setting a range for that. So because it's a long, under filter we had a choice of range, and we set the bottom to 1 and the top to 4. We also set a default value of 1, and we wanted that one to be optional as well. Now, last one is output files. So this is going to be data that our script creates, and it's going to be in the format of feature classes. But since our script is creating it, we want to change it to derived, and the direction automatically changed to output because you can only have output if it's derived. We also set that to multi-value, meaning that our script can generate multiple feature classes as output, and it will handle it. Here we have our GUI, which we just created. Notice that this one has a red X next to it because that script, the directory that I specified, does not exist. But it'll go away if we pick one that does. And did you see the fields that were listed there? Those are the fields that are in our farmland shapefile. Now if we select a different input for the first parameter, say trails, the second parameter will automatically update. It says, oh, there's no cover. So say we select ID, but did you see that those fields were automatically updated to the fields that are in the trails file? Notice that you can select multiple values for fruit type because we selected multi-value. And you can check or uncheck organic. It's just a checkbox because it was Boolean. Because this last pruning was a date type, it automatically generates this little calendar widget for you. You can select date and time, and so forth. And here our last one was a long type, so it has, and we set a range of 1 to 4. So it gives us that slider. Now, suppose we want our fruit types, instead of allowing the user to select multiple fruit types, that we just want them to be able to select one. They're only allowed to select apples or oranges or pears. Then we go and we can change multi-value. Did you see how we got back in here? We right-clicked on the script tool and selected property. Now if you find that something is in a different order on the widget than what you want it to be, you can just use those up arrows, select a thing and use the up arrows to move it around. We just moved quarter up above last pruning, and so that appears higher in there. And we also changed fruit type multi-value to be false, gave us a combo box, a drop-down menu, instead of those checkboxes that we had before. Notice finally that the output files, there is no widget for that, and that's because it's a derived output that is going to be created by our script. Also note that you can't run this thing. We haven't even pointed at a script. That's okay. This is a mock-up, so we're ready to take a screenshot and submit it.